The ad was for a room in a quiet apartment, with a roommate who kept to himself. What it didn't mention was that he had been living there, without aging a day, for over 60 years. Welcome to Echoed Chronicles. The story you're about to hear is the chronicle of a man who learned that some echoes are all that's left of a person. The decision to move to Chicago was a practical one, born from a spreadsheet and a job offer that was just good enough to warrant packing my entire life into a 10-year-old Honda Civic. The city was a grid of opportunities, a stark contrast to the sprawling, aimless town I'd grown up in. I was 23, armed with a degree in graphic design that felt more like a receipt than a key, and I was determined to make it work. The first and most immediate hurdle was finding a place to live. Chicago, I quickly learned, was a city that priced optimism out of the market. My salary, which had seemed so robust on paper, shriveled when confronted with the reality of rent in any neighborhood not actively on fire. This led me to the digital trenches of Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace, a gauntlet of grainy photos, suspiciously cheap basement units, and roommate ads that read like casting calls for a low-budget reality show. I needed something fast. My start date at a small marketing firm in the Loop was looming, and the thought of commuting from my parents' place 3 hours away was untenable. After a week of fruitless, depressing searching, I found it. The listing was for a 2-bedroom in Logan Square, a neighborhood I knew by reputation as being a mix of historic boulevards and trendy, artsy enclaves. The pictures were decent, hardwood floors, big windows that looked out onto a tree-lined street, a kitchen that had seen better days but was functional. The price was the real miracle. It was at least $300 less per month than anything comparable I'd seen. The catch, of course, was the roommate. The ad was posted by him. His name was Silas. The ad was sparse. Room for rent in 2-bed/1 bath. Quiet building. Must be clean, responsible. No pets, no smoking. Utilities split. That was it. No photos of himself, no description of his lifestyle or what he was looking for in a roommate beyond the basics. It was sterile, which I paradoxically found reassuring. It was better than the guys posting shirtless selfies or demanding a roommate who was 420 friendly and into philosophical debates after 2 a.m. I emailed him. He replied within the hour. His response was as brief as his ad. When can you see it? We set a time for that Saturday. The building was a classic Chicago 3-flat, a brick rectangle with a small, neat patch of grass out front. I pressed the buzzer for apartment number 2. A moment later, a flat, toneless buzz unlocked the main door. The stairwell was dim and smelled of dust and lemon-scented cleaner. As I reached the second-floor landing, the door to the apartment opened before I could knock. Silas was tidy. That was the first word that came to mind. He was of average height and build, with dark hair cut severely short, almost a buzz cut. He wore a plain gray t-shirt and dark jeans, both of which looked freshly laundered and pressed. There was an unnerving stillness about him. He didn't smile or offer a hand, just held the door open and watched me with dark, unblinking eyes. "You're Liam?" he asked. His voice was quiet, with a strange, flat resonance. "Yeah, that's me. Thanks for showing me the place." He just nodded and stepped back. "Come in." The apartment was exactly as advertised. The hardwood floors creaked pleasantly under my feet. The living room was large, dominated by one of those big bay windows that Chicago apartments are famous for. It was also almost completely empty. Against one wall was a small, severe-looking black couch. A single, bare-bones floor lamp stood in the corner. There was no coffee table, no television, no art on the walls. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a waiting room. "So this is the main living area," I said, trying to fill the silence. "Gets great light." "The sun faces west," Silas said, as if stating an astronomical fact. "It gets direct light after 3 p.m. He led me through the rest of the apartment. The kitchen was clean to the point of being sterile. There were no magnets on the fridge, no stray mail on the counter, no half-empty bottle of olive oil sitting next to the stove. The dish rack was empty. It looked like no one cooked here. The bathroom was the same. A single bar of white soap by the sink, a toothbrush in a holder, a plain gray towel hanging perfectly straight on the rack. "This would be your room," he said, pushing open a door at the end of the hall. It was a good-sized room with another large window and a decent closet. It was completely empty, the walls a uniform, slightly scuffed beige. I could already picture my desk under the window, my bed against the far wall. Felt like a blank canvas. "And your room is the other one?" I asked, pointing to the closed door next to it. "Yes." He offered no invitation to see it. We stood in the hallway for a moment. The silence in the apartment was heavy, broken only by the distant hum of traffic from Logan Boulevard. I felt a small, inexplicable prickle of unease. There was just something off. The emptiness of the place, his clipped, emotionless way of speaking. But then I thought of my spreadsheet, of the rent prices elsewhere, of the ticking clock on my job offer. "So, you've lived here a while?" I asked, trying for conversational. 2 years, he said. "What do you do for work?" He paused for a beat too long. "I'm a data analyst for a logistics company." "Oh, cool. I'm starting a job downtown, graphic design." He just nodded, his expression unchanging. It was like talking to a statue. I decided to get to the point. "Look, the place is great. The rent is really great. I'm definitely interested. I'm quiet. I'm clean. I work a pretty standard 9 to 5. I can give you a security deposit and first month's rent today if we want to make it official." I expected some follow-up questions, maybe a request for references or a credit check. Instead, he just looked at me, his gaze intense, as if he were scanning me for information I wasn't providing. "Okay," he said finally. "The room is yours if you want it." And just like that, it was settled. I transferred him the money via Zelle right there in the empty living room. We signed a generic roommate agreement he printed from a folder on his laptop. The whole transaction took less than 10 minutes. As I was leaving, I turned at the door. "Hey, I didn't even think to ask. What's the deal with utilities? How do we split them?" "I handle it," he said. "The rent you pay me is all-inclusive. I prefer it that way. It's cleaner." It was an odd arrangement, but it was also a good one for me. One less thing to worry about. I thanked him again and walked back down the stairs, the key to my new life feeling heavy and real in my hand. I told myself the weird vibe was just him being an introvert, a private person. I told myself I'd gotten lucky, landing a perfect apartment at an impossible price. I walked out into the bright Saturday afternoon, feeling a sense of accomplishment, and actively pushed the memory of his cold, still eyes to the back of my mind. 2 weeks later, I pulled my loaded Civic onto his street. The move itself was a sweaty, grueling affair, performed mostly by me and my dad, who had driven in to help. We hauled boxes up the 2 flights of stairs, the building silent the entire time. There was no sign of Silas. A single note was taped to my bedroom door, written in a small, precise, all-caps print. "Welcome. Please be mindful of the downstairs neighbors when moving heavy items." "Your roommate seems like a character," my dad said, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "He's just quiet," I said, a little defensively. "Keeps to himself." By the time we were done, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across my new, box-filled room. My dad clapped me on the shoulder, gave me $200 for groceries and essentials, and left to begin his long drive home. The apartment door clicked shut behind him, and the silence that followed was absolute. I was alone. I stood in the middle of my room, surrounded by the cardboard and tape archaeology of my past life. For the first time, it hit me that this was it. I lived here now. I lived here with Silas. I spent the next few days in a flurry of unpacking. I assembled my IKEA bed frame, arranged my books on a cheap shelf, and hung a few posters on the walls to cover the beige emptiness. My room started to feel like mine, a small island of personality in the sea of Silas's minimalism. Our interactions were sparse and fleeting. I'd see him in the morning sometimes. He'd be standing in the kitchen, drinking a glass of water, already dressed in a nondescript button-down shirt and slacks. "Morning," I'd say. "Good morning, Liam," he'd reply, his voice always the same quiet monotone. Then he would rinse his glass, place it in the dish rack, and be out the door before I had even started the coffee maker. I never saw him bring home groceries. My side of the fridge quickly filled up with milk, eggs, leftovers, and beer. His side remained empty except for a single bottle of filtered water, which was always full. I never smelled food cooking from his room. I never heard a television or music. The only sound that ever came from behind his closed door was the faint, rhythmic clicking of a keyboard, sometimes late into the night. It was strange, but I convinced myself it was fine. It was better than having a loud, messy roommate. We coexisted peacefully. I paid him my rent on the first of the month, he paid the bills, and we lived like ghosts haunting the same set of rooms. I started my new job, fell into a routine. Wake up, commute on the blue line, work, commute back, make dinner, watch something on my laptop in my room, sleep. The apartment was just a place to store my things and rest my head. The first truly weird thing happened about a month in. It was small, so small I almost didn't register it. I have a very specific routine. I get home, drop my keys in a small ceramic bowl I keep on the little table by the door, take off my shoes, and head to my room. One Tuesday evening, I got home, exhausted from a long day. I went to drop my keys, and my hand met an empty bowl. I frowned. That was weird. I never put them anywhere else. I checked my jacket pockets, my pants pockets, my backpack. Nothing. Annoyed with myself for being so absent-minded, I started a full-scale search. I checked the kitchen counter, the bathroom, my bedroom floor. After 10 minutes of increasingly frustrated searching, I gave up and decided to make dinner. I opened the fridge to grab a beer, and there they were. My keys, sitting on the top shelf right next to the milk carton. There is no way, I thought. I would never, ever put my keys in the refrigerator. It was impossible. My mind raced. Did I do it without thinking? Was I that tired? It had to be me. Who else could it be? Silas was supposedly at work. I hadn't seen him. I took the keys, the metal cold against my palm, and tried to laugh it off. The stress of the new job was clearly getting to me. But a few days later, something else happened. I had bought a specific kind of coffee, a light roast from a local place called Intelligentsia. It was expensive, a little treat for myself. I kept the bag on the counter next to the coffee maker. One morning, I went to make a cup and the bag was gone. Not just moved, gone. I searched the whole kitchen, the trash, the cupboards. It had vanished. I didn't want to accuse Silas, but it was bizarre. Later that day, I found the bag. It was in my own closet, tucked in the back, behind a stack of sweaters. Again, the cold wave of confusion. I didn't put it there. I knew with absolute certainty that I did not walk into my bedroom, open my closet, and place a bag of coffee beans behind my clothes. The only other person with a key to the apartment was Silas. I decided I had to ask him. That evening, when I heard him come in, I stepped out into the hallway. "Hey, Silas," I said, trying to sound casual. He stopped and turned, his face as impassive as ever. "Liam, weird question for you. Did you by any chance see a bag of coffee I had on the kitchen counter?" "Brown bag," said Intelligentsia on it. He stared at me. His eyes didn't even seem to blink. "No," he said. "I do not drink coffee. I would have no reason to touch your coffee." His denial was so flat, so absolute, that it made me feel foolish. Of course he didn't touch it. Why would he? And why would he hide it in my closet? It made no sense. Right? Okay. I must have misplaced it, I mumbled, feeling my cheeks flush. "Yes," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "You must have." He then turned and walked to his room, closing the door softly behind him. I was left standing in the hall, the silence of the apartment pressing in on me. I was starting to feel like a stranger in my own home, and I was starting to wonder if my forgetfulness was the problem, or if I was living with someone who was playing a very strange, very subtle game. The thought was absurd, but it planted itself in my mind and began to grow. The line between my own fallibility and his potential influence was blurring, and that was more frightening than any misplaced object. The incidents, taken individually, were small enough to be dismissed. A book I was reading, left on the living room couch, would reappear on my nightstand. The volume on my laptop, which I always left at a specific level, would be muted when I opened it in the morning. The bathroom door, which I always left ajar to prevent mildew, would be firmly shut. Each time I'd be hit with that same jolt of cognitive dissonance. That's not where I left that. I didn't do that. My first instinct was always to blame myself. The human mind is a faulty machine. We are all creatures of habit, but also of distraction and fatigue. It was plausible, even probable, that I was simply misremembering, that the stress of a new city and a demanding job was making me scatterbrained. I clung to this explanation because the alternative was too disturbing to contemplate. The alternative meant that Silas, the silent, unobtrusive roommate, was entering my room when I was gone. It meant he was moving my things, subtly altering my environment for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom. I started conducting little experiments. I'd leave a pencil on my desk at a specific angle. I'd place a single coin on top of my dresser. I'd arrange the shoes in my closet in a particular order. I'd take a picture with my phone before I left for work, my own private, pathetic form of surveillance. Most days, everything would be exactly as I left it, and a wave of relief would wash over me. I'd feel stupid, paranoid. I was letting my imagination get the better of me. Silas was just a weird guy, not some master of psychological torment. But then, maybe once a week, something would be off. The pencil would be moved a few centimeters to the left. The coin would be gone, only to turn up in my jacket pocket the next day. A pair of sneakers would be swapped. The changes were always minor, always deniable. They were just significant enough to make me question my own sanity, but never overt enough to be definitive proof of anything. If I were to confront him, what would I even say? I am 99% sure you moved my pencil a quarter of an inch while I was at work. He would look at me with those blank, pitying eyes, and I would be the one who sounded insane. His greatest defense was my own fear of looking crazy. The nights were becoming the worst part. The apartment, so large and quiet, felt different in the dark. The normal sounds of an old building, the groan of pipes, the settling of the foundation, the rattle of the ancient radiator, started to sound sinister. I'd lie in bed, my ears straining against the silence, trying to decipher every creak and whisper from the walls. And from Silas's room there was the sound. It wasn't always there, but when it was, it burrowed into my brain. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was too slow and deliberate for typing. Sometimes it would go on for hours, a maddening, metronomic beat in the dead of night. I tried to imagine what could be making it. Was he repairing something? Tapping a pen on his desk? Meditating? None of the rational explanations felt right. The sound had a patient, methodical quality that unnerved me. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. It was almost 2 a.m., and the tapping had been going on since midnight. I had to be up for work in 4 hours. I got out of bed, my heart thumping, and crept out of my room. The hallway was pitch black. The only light was a thin, cold sliver coming from under Silas's door. I tiptoed closer, my bare feet silent on the old wood. As I got nearer, I could hear something else, something under the tapping. It was whispering. It was his voice, so low it was almost a vibration rather than a sound. It wasn't a phone call. There were no pauses for another person to speak. It was a continuous, monotonous drone. I pressed my ear against the cold wood of the door, holding my breath. I couldn't make out the words. It didn't even sound like English. The language was guttural, full of hard consonants and sibilant, hissing sounds that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was deeply, fundamentally unsettling. He was in his room, in the middle of the night, alone, tapping and whispering in a language I had never heard. I backed away from the door as quietly as I could and retreated to my room, sliding the lock on my door, a thing I had never done before. I got into bed, but I didn't sleep. I just lay there, listening to the muffled, incomprehensible murmuring from the next room, feeling a profound and primal fear, the fear of the unknown, the fear of what was on the other side of that wall. Who was this person I was sharing a home with? The apartment no longer felt like a shared space. It felt like his territory, and I was an intruder. I started to become obsessed. During the day at work, I'd find my mind drifting. I'd be staring at a color palette for a new ad campaign, but all I could see were Silas's dark, empty eyes. I tried Googling him. Silas Rennert, Chicago. The search results were a barren wasteland. I found a LinkedIn profile that matched the name and his claimed profession, data analyst at Verilogics Incorporated. The profile was a skeleton. No photo, no connections, no work history beyond his current job, which it said he'd started 2 years ago, the same amount of time he'd lived in the apartment. There was no Facebook, no Instagram, no Twitter. In the modern world, he was a digital ghost. It was as if he hadn't existed before he moved into that apartment. Verilogics Incorporated was also a dead end. I found a bare-bones website for a company with that name, based in a suburban office park in Schaumburg. The site looked like it was designed in 1998. There was a generic contact us page with a post office box address and no phone number. It all felt fake. A flimsy digital facade created to lend him an air of legitimacy. My paranoia grew, feeding on these little scraps of strangeness. I began to feel watched, even when I was alone. I'd be sitting at my desk in my room, the door closed and locked, and I'd get the distinct, chilling sensation that someone was standing right behind me. I'd whip my head around, my heart pounding, to find nothing but empty air. But the feeling lingered, a cold spot in the room. I started to look for physical evidence, something concrete I could hold on to. I needed to know what was in his room, the one place he never let me see. I waited for a day when I knew he'd be gone. He had mentioned, in his usual clipped manner, that he had a full-day data audit at the main office. This was my chance. Waiting for him to leave that morning was agonizing. I listened to his routine from my room. The sound of his door opening, his quiet footsteps in the hall, the click of the front door. I waited another 20 minutes, just to be sure he was really gone. Then, with my pulse hammering in my ears, I walked to his door. The knob was a simple, old-fashioned brass one. I turned it slowly. Locked. Of course, it was locked. I was almost relieved. It was a barrier, a sign that I should stop. But the obsession was stronger than my fear. I remembered seeing a set of old, skeleton-style keys in a junk drawer in the kitchen. Maybe one would work. My hands were shaking as I rummaged through the drawer, past old batteries, rubber bands, and takeout menus. I found the small ring of rusted keys. There were 3 of them. I brought them back to his door. The first one didn't fit in the keyhole. The second one slid in but wouldn't turn. My heart sank. I tried the third key. It slid in smoothly. I held my breath and turned it. With a quiet, grinding click, the lock disengaged. For a moment, I just stood there, my hand on the doorknob. This was a massive violation of privacy, a line I had never crossed with anyone. But I had to know. I pushed the door open. His room was the polar opposite of mine. Where my room was a controlled clutter of books, clothes, and personal effects, his was a void. It was even more Spartan than the rest of the apartment. A single mattress, neatly made with a plain gray blanket, lay on the floor in one corner. There was no bed frame. In the center of the room, there was a small, simple wooden desk and a matching chair. A laptop sat closed on the desk. That was it. No closet, because the room didn't have one. No dresser. No art. No books. No possessions of any kind. The walls were bare. The floor was clean. It was the room of someone who could pack up and leave in 5 minutes. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The most disturbing part was the floor. Around the desk, the hardwood was covered in a series of strange, intricate markings. They weren't drawn or painted on. They were scratched deeply into the wood. A complex web of symbols and geometric shapes I didn't recognize. They spiraled out from the legs of the desk chair, forming a large, elaborate circle that took up most of the room. It looked ancient, ritualistic. My blood ran cold. This was not the room of a data analyst. This was something else entirely. I walked closer, my eyes tracing the sharp, deliberate lines in the floor. They were precise, not random doodles. They were a pattern, a design. My gaze fell upon the desk. Next to the closed laptop was a single object, A small, smooth, black stone, perfectly symmetrical and cold to the touch. And then I saw the wall behind the desk. At first, it looked like the other walls, empty and beige, but as my eyes adjusted to the light, I saw faint impressions. Hundreds of them, tiny, almost imperceptible pinpricks, arranged in clusters. It looked like someone had been pinning things to the wall over and over again in the same spots. I stepped closer and ran my fingers over the wall. The texture was rough, dotted with countless tiny holes. My mind reeled, trying to connect the pieces. The locked room, the whispering in a strange language, the rhythmic tapping, the symbols scratched into the floor, the wall that looked like it had been used as a giant pincushion. What was he doing in here? A noise from the front of the apartment jolted me back to reality. The sound of a key in the front door. Panic, pure and absolute, seized me. He was back. He wasn't supposed to be back. I scrambled out of the room, pulling the door shut behind me. My hands fumbled with the old key, my fingers slick with sweat. I jammed it into the lock, turned it. It made a loud, ugly scraping sound as it locked. Too loud. I sprinted the few feet to my own room and threw myself inside, shutting the door just as I heard his footsteps in the hallway. I stood with my back pressed against my door, my body trembling, not daring to breathe. I heard him pause, right outside my door. The silence stretched for an eternity. I could feel his presence on the other side of the wood, a palpable weight. My entire world had shrunk to this single, terrifying moment. He knew. He had to know. He heard the lock. He could probably smell my fear. Then, I heard the soft, almost silent click of his own door opening, and then closing. He was back in his room. I slid down to the floor, my legs too weak to hold me, and finally let out the breath I had been holding in a ragged, silent gasp. I had seen something I was not meant to see, and now I was no longer just living with a strange man. I was trapped in a small apartment with a keeper of some terrible, incomprehensible secret. The fear was no longer ambiguous. It was sharp, specific, and it was pointed right at me. The hours that followed were a form of paralysis. I didn't move from my spot on the floor, my back pressed against the door, until the muscles in my legs began to cramp and scream in protest. The silence from the rest of the apartment was absolute, yet it felt charged, alive with menace. Every random creak of the building was, in my mind, the sound of his doorknob turning. I imagined him standing in the hallway, listening. I imagined him looking at the scratches on his own door from the old key, marks that hadn't been there when he left that morning. I had been caught, maybe not in the act, but in the aftermath. The evidence was undeniable. Sleep was impossible. I eventually crawled into my bed, but I didn't turn off the lights. I lay under the covers, fully clothed, staring at my locked door, waiting for it to open. I thought about the symbols on the floor, trying to recreate them in my mind's eye. They were sharp, geometric, yet they flowed into one another in a way that felt organic, like a circuit board designed by something that didn't follow the laws of physics. And the pinpricks on the wall, what had he been pinning up? Over and over and over again. The methodical repetition was what scared me the most. This wasn't a sudden act of passion or madness. This was a process, a long, patient, ongoing project. When my alarm went off at 6:30, the sound was so violent in the tense quiet that I flinched, my body jolting. The thought of leaving my room, of having to see him, filled me with a cold, liquid dread. I could call in sick to work. I could stay in here all day. But what then? I couldn't hide forever. I had to face him. I had to pretend that last night never happened. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked my door and stepped into the hallway. The apartment was still. The morning light, gray and weak, filtered through the large living room window. Silas was in the kitchen, just as he always was, standing by the counter, drinking his glass of water. He was already dressed for work. He turned his head as I approached. His face was, as always, a perfect mask of neutrality. There was no anger in his eyes, no accusation. Nothing. It was almost worse than if he had been furious. "Good morning, Liam," he said. His voice was the same flat, quiet tone. "Morning," I managed to choke out. My voice was hoarse. I moved to the coffee maker, my hands shaking slightly as I scooped the grounds. I could feel his eyes on my back. I expected him to say something, to ask why I had been in his room, to show me the key marks on his door. But he said nothing. He just stood there, watching me. After a moment, I heard him rinse his glass and place it in the dish rack. Then his quiet footsteps moved towards the front door. "Have a good day at work," he said, his hand on the doorknob. I turned. "You too." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut, and the deadbolt slid into place. I was alone. I leaned against the counter, my whole body trembling with a mixture of terror and relief. He hadn't said anything. Was it possible he didn't know? That he hadn't heard the lock? That he hadn't seen the fresh scratches? No, that wasn't possible. The sound had been loud, a metallic shriek in the quiet hall. He knew. His silence was not forgiveness. It was a message. It was a display of power. He was telling me that he was in control, that he would decide when and how this would be addressed. The not knowing was the punishment. I forced myself to go through the motions of getting ready. I showered, got dressed, and headed for the Blue Line. The entire commute, I was lost in thought. The city around me, the screech of the train, the press of the crowd, the snippets of a dozen different conversations. It all felt distant, like a movie playing in the background. My reality had shrunk to the four walls of that apartment. At work, I was useless. I stared at my monitor, a new branding project for a line of organic dog food open on the screen, but the cheerful illustrations of happy dogs felt obscene. I opened a blank document and tried to sketch the symbols I had seen on Silas's floor. My memory was hazy, distorted by fear. I drew spirals and sharp, angular lines, trying to piece them together. The resulting image looked like a madman's scrawl. It didn't capture the horrifying precision of the original. I started searching online. Ritual symbols scratched in floor, geometric circle markings, ancient alphabets. I scrolled through pages of New Age websites selling crystals, academic articles on Celtic runes, and forums dedicated to conspiracy theories. Nothing matched. The symbols in Silas's room felt older, stranger, their design logic completely alien. When I got home that evening, the apartment was quiet. Silas's door was closed. I went straight to my room, locking the door behind me. I didn't want to cook, didn't want to exist in the shared spaces. I ate a protein bar from my backpack and sat on my bed. I needed a plan. I couldn't keep living like this. The obvious answer was to move out. But I had signed the roommate agreement. I had paid a security deposit. Breaking the agreement meant losing that money, and I was living paycheck to paycheck. The spreadsheet that had brought me to Chicago now served as a cage, its neat columns trapping me here. And where would I even go? The thought of starting the apartment search all over again was exhausting. More than that, a darker thought intruded. What if he didn't want me to leave? The next day, the game changed. I came home from work, my nerves already frayed. I dropped my keys in the bowl. I had checked, and they were still there from the morning, and went to my room. I stopped dead in the doorway. On the exact center of my pillow, placed with perfect precision, was a single old rusted key. It was one of the keys from the kitchen junk drawer, the one that had opened his door. I stared at it, my blood turning to ice. This was it. The confirmation. This was not in my head. This was not me being forgetful. This was a deliberate act. He had entered my locked room. How? Did he have a key to my lock too? And left this totem. It was a trophy, a warning, an unmistakable message. Asterisk, I know what you did. I can go wherever I want. You have no secrets here. Asterisk, I didn't touch the key. I left it there, a monument to my terror. That night, the tapping from his room started earlier than usual. Tap, tap, tap. It was louder this time, I thought, more insistent, and underneath it, the low, guttural whispering. I buried my head under my pillows, but the sound seemed to vibrate through the mattress, through my own bones. I knew I needed help. I couldn't handle this alone. But who could I tell? My parents would tell me to come home. My new work friends would think I was having a breakdown. I needed someone to believe me, I thought of the note Silas had left on my door when I first moved in. Be mindful of the downstairs neighbors. The neighbors, they lived directly underneath him. If he was tapping on the floor, scratching cymbals into the wood, surely they must have heard something. Maybe they knew something about him. Maybe they knew what happened to the person who lived in my room before me. Took me 2 days to work up the courage. On Saturday afternoon, I knew Silas was out. I had heard him leave early that morning. I stood at my front door for a full 5 minutes, my hand hovering over the knob. Then I walked out and down the single flight of stairs to the first-floor apartment. The door was identical to ours, just with a 1 on it. There was no name on the buzzer. I hesitated, my stomach churning. This was a crazy thing to do. "Excuse me, does my roommate seem like a demonic cultist to you?" But the image of the key on my pillow pushed me forward. I knocked. I waited for what felt like a long time. I was about to give up and turn away when I heard the sound of multiple bolts being unslidden. The door cracked open a few inches, held by a thick brass chain. And I, cloudy and surrounded by wrinkled skin, peered out at me. "Yes?" a woman's voice asked. It was raspy, heavy with disuse. Hi," I stammered. "Sorry to bother you. I live upstairs. In 2B. The eye blinked slowly. "I know who you are." "Oh, okay. Well, I just had a weird question for you. About my roommate." The woman was silent for a moment. Then the chain slid free and the door opened a little wider. She was an elderly woman, maybe in her late 70s, with a thin cloud of white hair. She wore a faded floral housecoat and leaned heavily on a walker. The apartment behind her was dim and cluttered, smelling of mothballs and old paper. "The quiet one," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah, that's him. I was just wondering. Do you ever hear anything from up there? Any strange noises?" A look I couldn't decipher crossed her face. It was a mix of fear and weariness. She glanced up at her own ceiling. "I hear things," she whispered, her voice dropping lower. "I've lived in this building for 40 years. I know it sounds. The noises from that apartment, they aren't building sounds." My heart leaped. She believed me, or at least she knew what I was talking about. "What do you hear?" I pressed, trying to keep my voice even. "Like tapping? Or talking?" She flinched at the word tapping. She looked past me, down the empty hallway, as if afraid he might materialize there. "Sometimes," she said, "but mostly, it's the quiet I don't like." Before him, there was a family up there. 2 little kids. Noise all day long. Before them, a group of college students. Music. Parties. That apartment was always alive. But for 2 years now, it's been silent. Dead silent. Except when it isn't. "Do you know anything about him?" I asked. "Where he came from?" She shook her head slowly. "He just appeared. The landlord doesn't live in the state. Hired a property manager who just puts ads online. Never meets anyone. The boy before you. The one who had your room." She trailed off, her gaze becoming distant. "What about him?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What happened to him?" The old woman leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss. "He left in the middle of the night. Just packed his car and disappeared. Left half his things behind. A month's rent already paid. I saw him from my window. He looked hunted." She paused, her cloudy eyes fixing on mine. "He looked just like you do now." A chill that had nothing to do with the drafty old building snaked its way up my spine. Hunted. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and sharp. The boy before me, he hadn't just moved out. He had fled. He had abandoned his possessions and a month's rent just to get away. "Did he ever say anything to you?" I asked, my voice strained. "About Silas?" The old woman, whose name I still didn't know, shook her head again. A slow, tired motion. "He wasn't a talker, kept to himself. But in his last week, he started. Knocked on my door once, looking just as spooked as you. Asked me if I'd been hearing walking at night. I told him, 'Honey, these old floors creak.' But it wasn't the creaking that bothered him. He said it sounded like someone was pacing in his room. while he was in bed. I felt the blood drain from my face. The feeling I'd had of a presence in my own locked room wasn't just paranoia. Someone else had felt it too. "Be careful, son," the woman said, her voice softening with what sounded like genuine pity. She started to close the door. "Some places, they get stained. And some people, they're the ones who do the staining." The door clicked shut. The bolts slid back into place. A series of solid, definitive thuds that echoed in the hallway. I was alone again, but my fear now had a companion. Validation. I wasn't going crazy. The previous tenant had experienced the same creeping dread, the same inexplicable events. He had run. The thought was sobering. What did he know that I didn't? What was the final straw that made him abandon everything and flee into the night? I walked back up the stairs, my feet feeling like lead weights. The key was still sitting on my pillow, a brass and rust accusation. I picked it up, its cold, jagged edges digging into my palm, and threw it back into the kitchen junk drawer, burying it under the clutter. But I couldn't bury the knowledge of what it represented. Life with Silas transformed from a state of quiet unease into a cold war. The subtle games of moving objects stopped. The directness of the key on my pillow had changed the dynamic. Now, the psychological pressure was applied differently. It was in his silence, which was heavier, more deliberate. It was in his stare, which lingered a moment too long when we passed in the hallway. He knew that I knew. I knew that he knew. And we both knew that neither of us was going to talk about it. One evening, I was cooking dinner. I had decided to reclaim the shared spaces, a small act of defiance. I was chopping onions at the kitchen counter, the sizzle of olive oil in a pan the only sound. Silas walked in. He didn't go to the fridge for his water. He just stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, watching me. He was perfectly still. I continued chopping, the rhythmic thud of the knife on the cutting board a counterpoint to my hammering heart. I refused to look up. After a full minute of this suffocating silence, he spoke. "The blade is sharp." His voice, quiet as it was, made me jump. I stopped chopping. "What?" "The knife," he said, his eyes fixed on it. "It's important to maintain your tools. A dull blade is more dangerous than a sharp one. It can slip." On the surface, it was a simple, innocuous observation. But in the context of everything else, it felt like a threat. It was a commentary on my actions, a veiled warning. My grip tightened on the knife handle. Was he talking about the knife or about my prying? About the key I had used? My dull, clumsy attempt to uncover his secrets? "It's sharp enough," I said, forcing a calm I didn't feel. He nodded slowly, a single, deliberate dip of his chin. "Good." Then he turned and walked to his room, leaving me alone in the kitchen, my hand trembling, the smell of onions making my eyes water. I needed to find out who the previous tenant was. If I could talk to him, maybe I could understand what I was up against. The old woman downstairs hadn't known his name. The landlord was a ghost. That left Silas himself. His laptop. The roommate agreement we had signed was a generic template I'd downloaded. But the one he'd signed with the previous tenant might still be on his computer. It was a huge risk. Going into his room again, after being caught, was insane. But the alternative, living in the state of constant low-grade terror, waiting for the next escalation, was worse. I waited a week, a tense, miserable week where every interaction was fraught with unspoken meaning. I studied his routine. He left at 7:45 a.m. every morning and returned at 6:15 p.m. almost every evening. He never seemed to deviate. I had to be fast. The next Wednesday, I called in sick to work again, claiming a migraine. My boss was starting to sound suspicious, but I didn't care. I listened for Silas's departure. The front door clicked shut. I gave it 30 minutes this time, pacing my room like a caged animal. Then I went to the kitchen drawer. The old keys were still there. My hand closed around the one that had worked before. Back at his door, I listened for a long, silent minute. Nothing. With my heart in my throat, I slid the key into the lock. It scraped, louder than I remembered. I turned it slowly, wincing at every groan of the old metal. The lock clicked open. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was exactly as I had left it. The mattress on the floor, the empty desk, the laptop, and the symbols, scratched into the floorboards, seemed to stare up at me like a malevolent eye. I didn't waste a second. I went straight to the desk, opened the laptop, powered on without a password. The desktop was completely blank, just a plain gray background. No icons, no files. My heart sank. Of course, it wouldn't be that easy. I started clicking through the basic folders. Documents, downloads, pictures. All of them were empty. It was a factory reset computer, wiped clean of any personal data. I was about to give up when my eyes fell on the browser icon. Chrome. I clicked it. It opened to a blank new tab. But on a hunch, I went to the browser history. It was a long shot. He seemed so meticulous, he probably cleared it every time. But as the page loaded, my breath caught in my throat. There were entries. Not many, but they were there. And they were terrifying. The search history was a list of horrors. Undetectable poisons, tasteless, odorless. Weight needed to crush a human windpipe. How to dissolve bone. Chicago Police Department response times, Logan Square. Forensic countermeasures, bleach and lye. I felt sick. I gripped the edge of the desk to steady myself. This wasn't about a strange religion or a weird hobby. This was research. This was planning. My mind flashed to the pinpricks on the wall. Was he pinning up news articles? Photos of victims? I scrolled further down, my hands shaking so badly I could barely control the trackpad. And then I saw it. A series of searches for a single name. Elias Vance. Elias Vance, Chicago. Elias Vance, missing. Elias, the boy before me, the one who had fled in the night. He was missing. Panic set in again, cold and sharp. I had to get out of there. But my morbid curiosity was a powerful force. I clicked on one of the links. It was a small news brief from a local Chicago blog, dated 6 months ago. Family seeks information on missing DePaul student. There was a picture of him. A young man, maybe 20, with a bright, friendly smile and kind eyes. The article said he was last seen near his Logan Square apartment. His family hadn't heard from him in weeks. He had missed his final exams. Police had checked his apartment and found many of his belongings still there, but no signs of foul play. The case had gone cold. No signs of foul play. Of course not. Silas was too careful for that. He researched forensic countermeasures. He would have cleaned up, wiped everything down, made it look like Elias had just walked away. I closed the laptop, my fingerprints suddenly feeling like a screaming indictment on the smooth plastic. I had to get out. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, the sound echoing in the silent room. As I turned to leave, my foot caught on something under the desk. I looked down. It was a loose floorboard. The edge of it was slightly raised, just a few millimeters, but enough to be noticeable if you were looking for it. I knelt down, my mind racing. What had Elias found? What had made him run? With trembling fingers, I pried at the edge of the board. It was stiff, but it came up, revealing a small, dark cavity underneath. And inside, there was something. It was a small, leather-bound journal. My heart hammered against my ribs. I reached in and pulled it out. It was small enough to fit in my hand. I flipped it open. The first page had a name written in neat cursive, Elias Vance. I didn't have time to read it. I had to go. I shoved the journal into the waistband of my jeans. The cool leather a terrifying weight against my skin. I replaced the floorboard, making sure it was flush. I stood up, took one last look around the horrifyingly sterile room, and left, locking the door behind me. I practically ran to my room, locking my own door, and leaned against it, gasping for air. I had it. I had the story. I had Elias's journal. I pulled it out, my hands trembling. The answers were in here. The truth of what happened in this apartment. The truth of what Silas was. I sat on my bed, the journal open in my lap, and began to read. The first few entries were mundane. Elias wrote about his classes at DePaul, about his part-time job at a coffee shop, about the excitement of living on his own for the first time. He described the apartment, the great light in the living room, the quiet neighborhood. Then he started writing about his roommate. October 3rd. My roommate Silas is a strange dude. Super quiet. Barely says a word. His room is like a monk's cell. But the rent is cheap, so whatever. Can't complain. October 12th. Weird thing happened today. I could have sworn I left my psych textbook on my desk, but I found it in the kitchen. Silas must have moved it, but why? He denies it. Says he never goes in my room. It's probably just me being forgetful. The entries mirrored my own experience so closely it was chilling. The misplaced objects, the self-doubt, the slow, creeping realization that something was wrong. Then, the entries took a darker turn. November 5th. I hear him at night, tapping, and he talks to himself. Not like normal talking. It's a whisper. Sounds wrong. I can't sleep. I feel like he's always listening. November 21st. I'm not crazy. He is doing this. He moves my stuff to make me feel like I'm losing my mind. Today I found my car keys in the freezer. I confronted him. He just stared at me, didn't even blink. He said, "You should be more careful with your things, Elias." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat. The final entries were frantic, written in a messy, panicked scrawl. December 1st. I got into his room. I had to know. There are symbols scratched all over the floor. It's a shrine to something awful. I found his search history. He's been looking me up. My family, my friends. He knows where I'm from. He knows everything about me. December 4th. I have to get out. I can't stay here another night. I think he knows I know. The way he looks at me is not human. I'm packing a bag. I'm just going to leave. I can't go to the police. What would I tell them? That my roommate is creepy? They'll think I'm the crazy one. I'm leaving this journal here under the floor. In case something happens to me. In case he finds me. My name is Elias Vance. If you are reading this, he is not what he seems. Get out. Get out now. That was the last entry. I closed the journal, my whole body shaking. Elias hadn't fled. He had tried to, but Silas had been searching for him. And Silas had researched how to make someone disappear. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. My head snapped up, my eyes wide with terror, fixed on my locked door. It wasn't the building settling. It was a footstep. It was right outside my room. He was home. He had come back early. And I had the journal. I had the proof. I had the one thing that could expose him. He couldn't let me leave with it. The doorknob began to turn. Slowly, silently, my breath hitched in my throat. A dry, rasping sound in the crushing silence. The doorknob. It was turning, but my door was locked. I had slid the deadbolt. A futile gesture, I now realized. The metallic click of the bolt sliding back was unnervingly soft, almost surgical. He had a key. Of course, he had a key. He had a key for every door in this apartment. The door swung inward with a faint, whispering creak. Silas stood in the doorway, his form a dark silhouette against the dim light of the hall. He wasn't in his work clothes. He wore the same plain gray t-shirt and dark jeans as the day I first met him. His face was unreadable, but his stillness was different this time. It wasn't passive. It was predatory. It was the stillness of a snake before it strikes. His eyes, dark and flat, flicked from my face, down to my hands, to the small leather-bound journal I was clutching with white-knuckled intensity. A flicker of something, not surprise but confirmation, passed through his gaze. He took a single, slow step into the room. Elias was careless, he said. His voice was the same quiet monotone, but it seemed to fill the room, to press in on me from all sides. He left loose ends. My mind was a chaotic storm of panic. I scrambled backward on my bed, trying to put distance between us, my back hitting the cold wall. "Stay away from me," I said, the words coming out as a pathetic, shaky whisper. You were not meant to find that, he continued, taking another deliberate step. That was his mistake. It will not be mine. He wasn't rushing. He was taking his time, savoring the moment. The terror was the point. He had done this before. He had honed this process, refined it. The gaslighting, the psychological torment, it was all a prelude to this, to the final, quiet moment of absolute control. What did you do to him? I asked, my voice cracking. I needed to keep him talking. I needed to think. I helped him, Silas said. The corner of his mouth twitched, a horrifyingly alien movement on his blank face. It might have been a smile. He was burdened by his connections, his history, his name. I unburdened him. I made him clean. The word clean echoed his first message to me, his preference for an all-inclusive rent. It was his mantra: purity, emptiness, deletion. He wasn't a killer in the conventional sense. He was an eraser. I glanced around my room, my eyes darting, searching for a weapon, an escape. The window. It was 3 stories up, a straight drop to the concrete sidewalk. My desk lamp? Too flimsy. My phone was on the nightstand, just out of reach. Even if I could grab it, who would I call? My roommate is trying to cleanse me? I'd be dead before the dispatcher stopped asking questions. Silas took another step. He was halfway across the room now. He moved with a liquid grace that was completely at odds with his rigid, controlled posture. The police know about Elias, I blurted out, trying to find some leverage. They have a file. If I disappear, they'll look here. They'll look at you. They looked before, Silas said, his voice laced with something that sounded like contempt. They found a young man who couldn't handle the pressure of his life and walked away. That is the story the world understands. It is a tidy story. I am very tidy. He was close now. I could smell the faint, sterile scent of laundry detergent on his clothes. He raised his hands slowly. They were empty, but that was almost more terrifying. He didn't need a weapon. He had researched how to crush a windpipe. He knew the physics of it. In that split second, my survival instinct, buried under layers of fear and paralysis, finally kicked in. I wasn't Elias. I wouldn't be erased. I lunged, not at him, but to the side, off the bed. I grabbed the heaviest thing within reach, my laptop. I swung it with all the force I could muster, a desperate, clumsy arc aimed at his head. He reacted with startling speed, raising an arm to block it. The corner of the laptop connected with his forearm with a sickening thud of plastic against bone. He grunted, a short, sharp exhalation of pain. It was the first genuine, uncontrolled sound I had ever heard him make. It broke the spell. He was human. He could be hurt, but my attack had left me off balance. He dropped his injured arm and his other hand shot out, grabbing the front of my shirt. His grip was like iron. He yanked me forward, throwing me off my feet. I crashed into my desk, sending my lamp and a stack of books scattering to the floor. Pain exploded in my shoulder as it hit the sharp corner of the desk. I twisted, kicking out, my foot connecting with his knee. He stumbled back a step, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was enough. I scrambled away, crab-walking backward on the floor, my eyes never leaving him. Elias's journal had skittered under the bed. Silas straightened up, cradling his injured arm. His face was no longer a mask. It was contorted in a snarl of pure, cold fury. The quiet data analyst was gone. This was the thing that whispered in the dark. This was the thing that scratched symbols into the floor. "You have made this messy," he hissed, the whisper more menacing than any shout. He came at me again, faster this time. I kicked out wildly, trying to keep him at bay. My foot connected with his shin, but he barely seemed to notice. He was on top of me, his weight pressing me down, his hands reaching for my throat. I saw the symbols from his floor flash in my mind. A complex, terrifying web. This was it. This was the end. My name would be the next one in his search history. My flailing hand hit something hard and metallic on the floor, the base of the desk lamp. I grabbed it, my fingers closing around the heavy metal. It was awkward, unwieldy, but it was all I had. As his hands closed around my neck, constricting my airway, I swung the lamp base upward with every ounce of strength I had left. It hit him square in the temple. The sound was a wet, sickening crunch. His body went rigid. The pressure on my throat vanished. His eyes, for the first time, looked surprised. They were wide, unfocused. A thin line of dark blood trickled from his hairline, tracing a path down his pale skin. He swayed for a moment, like a building about to collapse, and then he fell. He crumpled sideways, landing heavily on the floor, his head hitting the hardwood with a final hollow thud. He didn't move. I lay on the floor, gasping for air, my throat raw and bruised. My ears were ringing. I stared at his still form, at the pool of blood that was slowly starting to form around his head. Was he dead? I had no idea. I couldn't bring myself to check. I scrambled to my feet, my body screaming in protest. I had to get out. I had to get the journal. I dropped to my knees, reached under the bed, and my fingers found the smooth leather spine. I pulled it out and shoved it into my pocket. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, my keys, my wallet. That was all. Everything else could be left behind. I would be like Elias. I would flee into the night, abandoning everything. But I would not be a ghost. I had the proof. I didn't look back at Silas's body. I ran out of my room, out of the apartment, leaving the door wide open. I pounded down the 2 flights of stairs, my footsteps echoing in the silent building. I burst out of the front door and into the cool Chicago night. The street was quiet, bathed in the orange glow of the streetlights. I didn't stop running. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like jelly. I ran without direction, just away. Away from the brick 3-flat. Away from the room with the scratched floors. Away from the man I may have just killed. I finally collapsed on a park bench several blocks away, my body trembling uncontrollably, the leather journal a hard, real object in my pocket. I had survived, but it wasn't over. My mind raced. What now? Call the police? Hello? I think I just killed my roommate, but he was a serial killer who was trying to cleanse me, and here's his victim's diary to prove it? Sounded insane. They would find my fingerprints all over the lamp. It would be my word against a dead man's. A dead man with a pristine, non-existent public record and a meticulously tidy life. And what if he wasn't dead? The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through me. What if he was just unconscious? He would wake up. He would be messy. He would come for me. He knew my name. He probably knew where my parents lived, where my friends were. He knew my digital footprint. He knew how to find people who didn't want to be found. I opened my phone. The screen was cracked from the fall. I had 17% battery left. I couldn't call the police. Not yet. I couldn't call my parents and put them in danger. I had one option: disappear. Become a ghost just like he had tried to make me. I pulled up a ride-sharing app. Where could I go? I looked at the map, a glowing grid of streets on my phone. I needed to get out of the city, out of the state. I typed in a destination, the first place that came to mind that was far away, a place with no connection to me. A bus station in a different city, Indianapolis. It was a 3-hour drive. From there, I could buy a ticket to anywhere. The car arrived in minutes, a beat-up Toyota Camry. The driver was a young guy listening to a podcast. He glanced at me in the rearview mirror, at my disheveled clothes, my wild eyes, the red marks on my throat that I could feel but not see. "Rough night?" he asked, trying to be friendly. "You have no idea," I whispered. As we pulled away from the curb, I looked back in the direction of the apartment. I couldn't see the building, but I could feel it, a dark spot on the city grid. I had escaped, but I knew with a chilling certainty that I would be looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life. I had left a mess. And Silas, or the idea of Silas, the thing that he was, did not like messes. The drive south on I-90 was a blur. The city lights of Chicago receded in the rearview mirror, a galaxy of bright promises that had become a constellation of fear. I had the journal, a piece of evidence that both vindicated and endangered me. As long as I had it, I had a story to tell. But as long as I had it, I was a target. The quiet apartment in Logan Square was behind me, but the memory of it, the cold, patient evil of it, was now a part of me, a roommate I would never be able to evict. The bus station in Indianapolis was a purgatory of fluorescent lights, sticky floors, and the smell of stale coffee and desperation. It was 3 a.m. I bought a one-way ticket for the next bus leaving, not even caring about its final destination. It was going to Nashville. That was fine. It was south. It was away. I found a seat in the waiting area, my back pressed into a corner, my eyes scanning the faces of the other transient souls. Every tall, quiet man who walked by sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. I imagined Silas walking through the automatic doors, his face a calm mask, his injured arm in a neat sling, his eyes scanning, always scanning. The paranoia was a physical thing, a constant thrumming under my skin. I took out Elias's journal. The bus wouldn't leave for another hour. I needed to read it again, more carefully this time, away from the immediate threat. I needed to absorb every detail, to burn it into my memory in case the physical book was ever lost or taken. I read about Elias's friends, his favorite class, art history, ironically, and his strained relationship with his father. These weren't just the panicked scrawls of a victim. They were the last records of a life Silas had meticulously researched and then deleted. As I read, I realized something new. Elias had started to notice a pattern in Silas's rare conversations. November 28th. He spoke to me today, asked me about my trip home for Thanksgiving. But the way he asked, it was like he was testing me. He asked about the highway I take, Route 30. He said, "That's a very lonely road at night. It's easy to get lost out there." It was so specific, so weird. How would he know that? My blood ran cold. He had been planning the logistics. He wasn't just going to make Elias disappear from the apartment. He was mapping his life, looking for the weak points, the isolated moments where a person could be plucked from the world without anyone noticing. I thought about my own life. Had he been doing the same to me? I remembered the brief conversation we'd had when I moved in. I had told him about my parents living 3 hours away. I had mentioned the town. It was a small, rural place. He had probably already looked at the map. He probably knew the roads. The bus to Nashville was old, the seats worn, the air thick with the scent of disinfectant. I found a seat by the window and watched the dark Indiana landscape slide by. I didn't sleep, couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the symbols on the floor, the pinpricks on the wall, the look in Silas's eyes as he crumpled to the ground. Did I kill him? The question looped endlessly in my head. I had swung the lamp base as hard as I could. The sound it made was final, but I hadn't checked for a pulse. I had just run. If he was dead, I was a killer. A killer with a good reason, maybe, but the law doesn't always care about reasons. If he was alive, he was a monster who was now hunting me. I wasn't sure which reality was worse. In Nashville, I didn't leave the bus station. I bought another ticket, this time for a bus heading west, towards Memphis. I paid in cash. I used a fake name I made up on the spot, Alex Miller. Liam Peterson had to disappear. I took my phone, the battery now dead, and threw it in a trash can in the men's room. It was a GPS tracker. It was a record of my life. It had to go. My digital ghostliness was a comfort and a terror. I was untraceable, but I was also cut off. No one on earth knew where I was. If Silas, or someone like him, found me in a cheap motel in Arkansas, no one would know to come looking. For days I drifted. Memphis to Little Rock to Dallas. I traveled by bus, sleeping in transit, eating cheap food from gas stations. I became one of the unseen, the people who live in the margins of the country. I kept my head down, avoided conversations, and paid for everything in cash from the money my dad had given me when I moved. It was dwindling fast. In a dusty motel on the outskirts of Fort Worth, Texas, I finally allowed myself to stop. The room was grimy, with a rust-stained shower and a television bolted to the dresser. But it had a lock, and for now that was enough. I bought a cheap prepaid phone from a corner store and a map of the United States. I needed a plan beyond just running. I spread the map out on the lumpy bed. Where could a person truly disappear in modern America? I thought about big cities where I could be an anonymous face in the crowd. But cities had cameras. They had databases. Silas was a data analyst. He lived in that world. He would find the patterns. My eyes drifted to the vast, empty spaces on the map. The deserts of the Southwest. The mountains of the Northwest. Places where people lived off the grid, where your nearest neighbor was miles away, where the digital world held less sway. I also had to decide what to do with the journal. It was a ticking bomb, the only thing that could prove my story, but also the one thing that could lead him to me. I thought about mailing it to a journalist or to the Chicago Police Department anonymously. But what if they intercepted it? What if Silas had people looking for it? The idea seemed paranoid, but I couldn't dismiss it. Then I noticed something in the journal I had overlooked. Tucked into a small pocket on the inside back cover was a folded piece of paper. My fingers, now grimy from days of travel, fumbled to get it out. It was a receipt, a faded, crumpled receipt from a place called Canyonland Storage in Moab, Utah. It was for the rental of a 5x5 unit. The name on the receipt was Elias Vance. The date was 2 days before his last journal entry. He had a storage unit. Why? He was a college student living in a 2-bedroom apartment. What did he need to store? The receipt had a unit number written on it. A37, Moab, Utah. My eyes found it on the map. It was a small town surrounded by a vast expanse of red rock desert. It was one of those empty spaces. Maybe Elias had a plan. Maybe he was moving his most important things out of the apartment, preparing to flee before Silas caught on. Maybe he had stored something there, something that could help me. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only lead I had that wasn't just aimless running. I had a destination. I had a purpose. It was a fragile hope, but it was better than nothing. The next morning, I bought another bus ticket. This one was going to take days, a winding, multi-stop journey across Texas, New Mexico, and into Utah. As the bus pulled out of Fort Worth, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt since I left Chicago. Agency. I wasn't just running from something anymore. I was running to something. The journey was a surreal montage of the American landscape. The flat plains of the Texas Panhandle gave way to the mesas of New Mexico. I saw sunsets that set the entire sky on fire. I saw towns that looked like they hadn't changed in 50 years. Through it all, I clutched the backpack that held my few possessions and Elias's journal. I finally arrived in Moab, exhausted and grimy. The town was nestled in a valley, surrounded by towering red cliffs. The air was dry and clean. It felt like another planet compared to the humid density of Chicago. Canyonland Storage was on the edge of town, a series of long, single-story buildings with bright blue roll-up doors, shimmering under the intense desert sun. The office was a small, dusty affair. A bored-looking woman with leathery skin sat behind the counter, reading a paperback novel. "Can I help you?" she asked without looking up. My heart was pounding. This was the moment of truth. "Yeah, I'm here to access a unit. For my friend, Elias Vance." She finally looked up, her eyes narrowed. "Vance. Haven't seen him in a while. Rent's overdue. Was gonna get auctioned off next month. He sent me to clear it out." I lied, my voice sounding thin and reedy. "He lost his key. Can you cut the lock for me? Gonna need to see some ID, honey. And a letter from him authorizing you." My stomach dropped. Of course, I should have known. I had no ID with my fake name. I had nothing. I was about to turn and leave, my desperate plan collapsing, when she sighed. "Look, is it Unit A37? I nodded, surprised. "Yeah, that's the one. He paid for a year up front. Only came here twice. Once to rent it, once a couple days later. Seemed like a nice kid. Scared, though." She looked me up and down, a long, appraising stare. "You look scared, too. Tell you what, I'm supposed to take a picture of your driver's license for the file. My phone's camera is broken." She tapped her ancient flip phone on the counter. "So I can't. Shame. I'll cut the lock for you. It's $20. Relief washed over me so intensely I felt dizzy. I fumbled in my pocket and pulled out a crumpled $20 bill. She took it, grabbed a massive pair of bolt cutters from behind the counter, and led me out into the blinding sun. We walked down a row of identical blue doors. The heat was oppressive. She stopped in front of A37. The lock was a heavy-duty padlock, now showing a bit of rust. "You sure you want what's in here?" she asked, hefting the bolt cutters. Felt to me like he was burying something, not storing it. "I'm sure," I said. With a loud snap, the lock broke and fell to the dusty ground. She pulled the roll-up door, which protested with a loud, groaning shriek. It opened to reveal a small, dark, 5x5 space. It wasn't empty. Against the back wall was a single, large, military-style footlocker. "That was it. All yours," the woman said, and walked back towards the office without a second glance. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest. What was in the trunk? Evidence? Weapons? Something worse? I took a deep breath, the hot, dry air searing my lungs, and stepped into the darkness of the storage unit. The trunk was closed with two simple latches. It wasn't locked. With trembling hands, I reached down and flipped them open. I lifted the heavy lid. My eyes widened. The trunk was full of papers. Old, yellowed newspaper clippings, faded photographs, stacks of what looked like research notes, bound with twine. On the very top was a photograph. It was a black and white picture of a man. He was standing in front of an old farmhouse. He was wearing a simple, dark suit. He had short, severe hair and dark, unblinking eyes. His face was a mask of neutrality. It was Silas, but the photograph was old. The car in the background looked like it was from the 1950s. I picked it up. Written on the back in faded ink was a name and a date. Silas H. Renner. March 1958. The last name was slightly different. Renner, not Renner. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. It had to be his father, his grandfather, a relative who looked uncannily like him. But as I started digging through the papers in the trunk, a more terrifying possibility began to emerge. There were dozens of photos, all of the same man. Silas in the 1960s, standing on a busy street in New York City. Silas in the 1970s in what looked like a college library. Silas in the 1980s, leaning against a car in Miami. In every single photo, he looked exactly the same. The same age, the same haircut, the same cold, empty eyes. He never aged. The newspaper clippings told a similar story, a trail of strange disappearances and unsolved missing persons cases, spanning decades and stretching across the entire country. A hiker who vanished from a trail in Oregon in 1967. A college student who disappeared from his dorm in Florida in 1982. A factory worker who walked out of his job in Ohio in 1995 and was never seen again. The articles were from small, local papers. The cases were unconnected, footnotes in local history. But Elias had connected them. His notes were meticulous, cross-referencing names, dates, and locations. And in each location, at the time of each disappearance, there was a record of a quiet, unassuming man who had lived there for a short time. A man with a name like Silas Renner or Simon Rent or Saul Renta. Always with the same initials. Always fitting the same description. Elias hadn't just discovered he was living with a murderer. He had discovered that he was living with something that wasn't human. Something that had been hunting people for over 60 years. The symbols on the floor, the whispering in the dark. It wasn't a ritual to gain power. It was maintenance. It was what the creature did to sustain itself. It didn't just kill people. Consumed them, their lives, their histories. It erased them, and somehow that's what kept it going. Kept it from aging. Kept it clean. I sat back on my heels, the dusty, hot air of the storage unit feeling suddenly freezing cold. The scope of it, the sheer scale of the horror was overwhelming. This wasn't a crime I could take to the police. This was an impossibility. I had stumbled into a story that had been going on since before I was born. And now I was part of it. The creature in Chicago knew my name. It knew I had this. The footlocker wasn't a coffin. It was an archive. It was the only proof that any of these people had ever existed. And Elias had entrusted it to this dusty box in the desert. He had left a trail, hoping someone would find it, hoping someone would understand. I understood now, and I knew that my journey wasn't over. Couldn't just run, couldn't just hide. I had the life stories of dozens of forgotten victims in a trunk in front of me. To run would be to let them be erased forever. I had to do something. But what? What do you do when the monster you're fighting is immortal? The weight of the discovery settled on me. A physical pressure in the sweltering heat of the storage unit. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was Elias's story. It was the story of the hiker in Oregon and the student in Florida and countless others. Their lives reduced to yellowed clippings in a trunk. I was no longer just a victim running for my life. I was a custodian of lost histories. I spent the next hour carefully packing the contents of the trunk into my own large backpack and a cheap duffel bag I'd bought in Texas. It was heavy, a tangible burden of proof. I left the empty footlocker in the unit and pulled the door shut. It didn't lock, but it didn't matter. The important thing was gone. Back in my grim motel room, I spread the contents out on the floor. The sheer volume of Elias's research was staggering. He must have spent months in libraries, poring over microfiche, sending away for public records. He had built a secret history of an invisible predator. He had found the pattern in the chaos. There were hand-drawn maps showing the locations of the disappearances. They formed a strange, meandering path across the country, a web with no discernible center. There were also sketches, dozens of them, sketches of the symbols he had seen on the floor. He had drawn them with an artist's precision, capturing their alien geometry far better than my frantic scribbles ever could. He had annotated them with question marks and theories. Energy transfer? A form of language? A map of something? One set of notes, bound in a separate folder, caught my eye. It was titled The Others. My heart hammered. Elias had found more than one. He had found evidence of other similar predators, other beings that operated in the same way, with the same methodical erasure of their victims. The names were different, the locations scattered, but the pattern was the same. A quiet, unassuming stranger, a sudden disappearance, and a cold case file left to gather dust. They weren't a group. They seemed to operate independently, like sharks in a vast ocean, but they were the same species of monster. Silas wasn't an anomaly. He was part of a hidden ecology. This changed everything. I wasn't just fighting a single entity in Chicago. I was up against a potentially global phenomenon. The thought was so vast, so terrifying, that I almost shut down. What could one person do against that? But Elias had done something. He had fought back with the only weapon he had: information. He had built this archive, and he had led me to it. I had to assume he had a reason. I needed to get off the grid, not just for a few days, but permanently. The cheap motel, the prepaid phone, it was all temporary. I needed to build a new life, a new identity, from scratch. I used the last of my cash to buy a beat-up 1990s pickup truck, the kind that was so common and unremarkable it was practically invisible. It had a camper shell on the back, a small, private space where I could sleep and, more importantly, a space to hide the archive. I started driving north, with no destination in mind other than away. I drove through the stark beauty of Utah, into the dense forests of Idaho and Montana. I took back roads, avoiding highways and cities. I learned to live on the margins. I worked odd jobs for cash, washing dishes, helping out on a farm, stacking firewood. I kept to myself. I spoke little. My fake name, Alex Miller, started to feel more real than my own. Liam Peterson was a ghost, a name in a yearbook, a face in a few family photos. I had to let him die so that Alex could live. The archive became my obsession. At night, in the cramped space of my camper shell, illuminated by a single battery-powered lantern, I studied Elias's work. I memorized the names of the victims. I traced the maps with my fingers. I tried to understand the symbols. They seemed to be the key. They were the one thing that connected all of these events. The one piece of tangible otherness that existed in the physical world. I bought books on symbology, on ancient languages, on theoretical physics, on fringe archaeology. I was looking for a Rosetta Stone, something that could help me decipher the language of the creature. The internet was too risky, but libraries in small towns were a godsend. I'd spend hours there, a quiet man in a worn jacket, poring over obscure texts, leaving no digital trail. One day, in a dusty library in a small town in rural Washington, I found something. It was in a book about Native American petroglyphs of the Pacific Northwest. One of the photos showed a rock carving that was startlingly familiar. It was a complex spiral, with sharp, angular offshoots. It was a variation of one of the core symbols from Silas's floor. The book described it as a spirit trap or a pathway to the shadow world, according to local tribal lore. The text dismissed it as superstition, but to me, it was a revelation. These things had been here for a long time, long enough to make their way into human mythology. They weren't invaders. They were a part of the world's dark background radiation. This new knowledge gave me a new, terrifying idea. If these symbols were a form of technology or language, could they be used against them? Elias had only ever documented them. But what if they could be replicated? What if they could be altered? What if you could disrupt the maintenance that Silas performed? It was a crazy, dangerous thought. To even attempt it, I would need to get close to one of them again. I would have to go from being the hunted to being the hunter. The very idea filled me with a paralyzing fear. I had barely survived my encounter with Silas. To willingly seek one out felt like suicide. For months, I did nothing. I kept driving, working, studying. I was safe in my anonymity, but the faces of the victims from the clippings haunted my dreams. Elias's frantic final journal entry was a constant echo in my mind. Asterisk, get out. Get out now. Asterisk, he had warned me to save myself. But maybe he had also armed me to do something more. The decision was made for me. One evening, I was in a small diner in a logging town near the Canadian border. I was nursing a cup of coffee, reading one of Elias's files. It was about a disappearance in this very region, from the late 1990s. A young woman who had been working as a seasonal forest ranger had vanished from her watchtower. The file mentioned a quiet man who had been seen camping in the area. A man who matched the description of Silas. A man sat down in the booth across from me. I didn't look up immediately, lost in my thoughts. When I did, my blood ran cold. It wasn't Silas, but it could have been his brother. He was older, his hair graying at the temples, but he had the same unnerving stillness. The same flat, dark eyes. The same plain, tidy clothes. He was one of them. He smiled, a thin, dry little smile. "You have something that belongs to a friend of mine," he said. His voice was soft, reasonable. "He is very messy when he is upset. I am here to clean up." My heart felt like it was going to explode. He had found me. After all this time, after all my precautions. How? My truck? An old-fashioned PI? Or was their network more advanced than I could imagine? "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, my voice barely a whisper. My hand instinctively tightened on the backpack at my feet, the one containing the archive. "Let's not be difficult, Mr. Peterson," he said, and the use of my real name hit me like a physical blow. "The journal, the files, the research, it's an internal matter. It doesn't concern you. Give it to me, and you can walk away. You can have your life back." My life back? The life of a hunted animal, always looking over my shoulder? I knew it was a lie. If I gave him the archive, I was a loose end. A loose end he was here to clean up. I looked at him, at his calm, confident face. He thought he had me cornered. He thought I was just another frightened human. But I wasn't the same person who had fled Chicago. I had spent months studying his kind. I had Elias's knowledge, and I had a crazy, desperate idea. "Okay," I said, my voice shaking, hoping it sounded like fear. "It's in my truck. I'll get it." He nodded, satisfied. "I'll come with you." We walked out of the diner and into the twilight. The air was cold and smelled of pine needles and wet earth. My truck was parked at the far end of the lot, under a flickering street light. As we walked, my mind raced. I had one chance. One insane, stupid chance. In my backpack, Along with the files, I carried a small toolkit. In it was a set of wood-carving gouges. I had been practicing. In my camper, on scraps of plywood, I had been trying to replicate the symbols. I wasn't an artist like Elias, but I had gotten close. We reached the truck. "It's in the back," I said, my hand on the handle of the camper shell. "Open it," he commanded, standing close behind me. Too close. I unlocked the camper shell and lifted the door. I reached in, pretending to grab the duffel bag. My hand closed around the handle of the sharpest, narrowest gouge. I took a deep breath. It was now or never. I spun around, not attacking him, but lunging for the side of my own truck. In a single, desperate motion, I started carving into the dusty, painted metal of the door panel. I scraped and gouged, the sound of metal on metal a screech in the quiet evening. I wasn't drawing the symbol exactly as Elias had. I was drawing it wrong. I was reversing a key component, breaking a line that should have been connected, based on a half-remembered theory from a book on sympathetic magic that I'd read. The idea was to corrupt the circuit, to create feedback. The man stared at me, his calm expression finally breaking into one of confusion and then dawning horror. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "Stop!" He lunged for me, but he was too late. I finished the last, jagged line. For a second, nothing happened. The man reached for me, his fingers like claws. And then, a change occurred. A low hum filled the air, a vibration that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The man froze, his hand hovering inches from my face. A look of agony crossed his features. He clutched his head, a choked gasp escaping his lips. The air around him seemed to shimmer, to distort, like heat haze off asphalt. His form began to flicker, like a bad television signal. He was still solid, but he was also becoming transparent. I could see the diner through his chest. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a terror that dwarfed anything I had ever felt. It was the look of a being whose fundamental reality was being undone. "What did you do?" he whispered, but his voice was distorted, echoing, as if coming from a great distance. Then, with a sound like 1,000 sheets of paper being ripped at once, he imploded. There was no explosion, no gore. One moment he was there, a flickering, transparent man in agony. The next, there was just empty space. A faint smell of ozone and burnt sugar hung in the air. I stood there, panting, the carving tool still clutched in my hand. On the side of my truck was a crude, ugly carving, a corrupted symbol that had, somehow, unmade a monster. I had done it. My crazy theory had worked. I had found a weapon, but my victory was short-lived. A new, chilling realization dawned on me. This man had been sent, which meant Silas, or whatever he was, knew I was alive. He knew I had the archive, and now he would know I had a way to fight back. I hadn't ended the war. I had just escalated it beyond anything I could have ever imagined. I was no longer just a custodian of the past. I was a soldier in a secret, ancient conflict, armed with a terrible and unpredictable power. My life as Alex Miller, the quiet drifter, was over. A new, far more dangerous life had just begun. The smell of ozone faded into the crisp, pine-scented air of the Pacific Northwest, but the silence the creature left behind was deafening. I stared at the empty space in the parking lot, my mind struggling to accept what my eyes had just seen. He hadn't just died, he had been deleted from reality. The corrupted symbol I had carved into my truck was a weapon, a piece of viral code for their very existence. My legs gave out, and I slid down the side of my truck, my back pressing against the crude, powerful carving. The gouge fell from my nerveless fingers and clattered on the asphalt. I had won, but it felt nothing like victory. I had just confirmed that the fundamental laws of physics, as I understood them, were merely suggestions. Panic began to bubble up again, hot and acidic. The creature in the diner had been a messenger, a cleanup crew. When he didn't report back, Silas would know. He would know I had survived. He would know I had the archive. And now, he would know I had a weapon. He wouldn't send another messenger. Next time, he would come himself. I scrambled back into my truck, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key in the ignition. I had to get out of that town, away from the scene of the impossible crime. I drove out of the parking lot, not looking back, and merged onto a dark, two-lane highway heading deeper into the mountains. My mind was a whirlwind. The symbol, it was a double-edged sword. It had saved my life, but its power was terrifying and unpredictable. What were the rules? Did it only work on them? What would happen if a person touched it? The ugly scratch on the side of my truck now felt like a leaking canister of radioactive waste. The first thing I did when I found a secluded logging road was to pull over, grab a can of black spray paint I had for touch-ups, and cover the symbol completely. I didn't know if that would neutralize it, but I couldn't bear to look at it. For the next few weeks, I was a ghost. I drove aimlessly, staying in the deep woods, sleeping in my camper, avoiding towns unless it was absolutely necessary to get gas or supplies. The archive, once a source of grim purpose, now felt like bait. Every rustle of leaves outside my truck at night, every shadow that moved in the periphery of my vision, was him. I knew I couldn't keep running. Running was a short-term solution to a permanent problem. Silas was patient. He had been hunting people for the better part of a century. He could wait. I, on the other hand, was mortal. I would get tired. I would get sick. I would get old. I would make a mistake. I had to change the game. I had to go from defense to offense. The thought was insane. It meant going back. It meant facing Silas. But what other choice did I have? I could spend the rest of my short, terrified life running, or I could try to end it. The archive was my only advantage. Elias's research was my playbook. I started to study it with a new, desperate focus. I wasn't just learning about their past. I was trying to understand their nature, to find a weakness beyond the symbols. I found it in a small, overlooked detail in one of Elias's last, frantic notes. Asterisk December 2nd. He has to stay there, in the apartment. The tapping, the whispering, it's not just a ritual. It's a charge. Like a battery. I think he's tied to the place. I think the symbols on the floor anchor him there. He's strong, but maybe his influence, his power, is geographically limited. Asterisk. An anchor. He was tied to the apartment. That explained why he hadn't just come after me himself, why he had sent another. Maybe he couldn't operate effectively outside of his clean space. Maybe the apartment in Logan Square wasn't just his home. Maybe it was his power source. The place he had stained, as the old woman had said. If that was true, then the key to defeating him wasn't in some remote wilderness. It was in Chicago. It was in that apartment. It was on that floor. A plan, cold and terrifying, began to form in my mind. I had to go back to the source. I had to destroy the anchor. If I could erase the symbols he had scratched into the floor, maybe I could cut him off, weaken him, make him vulnerable. The journey back east was a reversal of my desperate flight. Every mile closer to Chicago felt like a step deeper into the lion's den. I sold my truck in a town in Wyoming and bought a nondescript sedan. I cut my hair, bought new clothes. I became a different person again. I was no longer Alex Miller, the drifter. I was someone else, someone with a grim purpose, heading towards a confrontation. I drove the final leg at night, arriving on the outskirts of Chicago in the pre-dawn hours. The city skyline, which had once represented hope and a new beginning, now looked like the jagged teeth of a massive trap. I found a cheap motel near O'Hare, miles from Logan Square, and paid for a week in cash. I needed to do surveillance. I needed to know if he was still there, if the apartment was still occupied. For 2 days, I watched the building from a distance. I sat in my parked car down the street, drinking bad coffee and eating stale donuts, my heart a cold, heavy lump in my chest. I watched the residents of the building come and go. I saw the old woman from the first floor shuffle out to get her mail. Everything looked normal, too normal. On the third evening, I saw him. He walked out the front door, dressed in his usual nondescript slacks and button-down shirt. He looked exactly the same, unchanged, unaged. He got into a modest, dark-colored sedan. Not the one I remembered, a newer model, and drove away. He was still there. The anchor was still active. Now I had to figure out how to get inside. I couldn't use a key this time. I needed to get into his apartment when he wasn't there, and I needed enough time to do some serious damage to his hardwood floors. My first thought was to wait for him to leave for his job at the fictional Verilogics Incorporated. But that was too risky. I didn't know his schedule anymore. He might come back unexpectedly. I needed a guaranteed window of time. That's when I thought of the old woman on the first floor. She knew something was wrong. She was scared of him. Maybe she would help me. It was a massive risk involving another person in this madness. But I was out of options. The next afternoon, after I saw Silas leave, I walked up to the front of the building. My heart pounded as I pressed the buzzer for apartment 1. The same raspy voice came through the speaker. "Yes, it's Liam," I said, my voice low. "The man who used to live upstairs. I need to talk to you. It's important." There was a long silence. I thought she was going to ignore me. Then the lock buzzed. She opened the door on the chain just like before. Her cloudy eyes widened slightly when she saw me. "You," she whispered. I thought you were gone." "I am," I said, "but I had to come back. I need your help. I know what he is. I know what's in that apartment. And I think I know how to stop him." I told her everything. The journal, the archive, the creature in the diner, the symbols, the anchor. I laid it all out. She listened, her face a mask of dawning horror and, strangely, belief. I wasn't telling her anything she didn't, on some level, already know. I was just giving a name to the nameless dread she had been living with for 2 years. "I need to get in there," I finished. "I need to destroy the floor." Her name, I learned, was Mrs. Du Bois. She had lived in that building since she was a young bride. She had seen generations of tenants come and go. "He leaves," she said, her voice firming with a resolve I hadn't expected. "Every third Thursday. He leaves in the evening and doesn't come back until late the next night. I don't know where he goes, but it's regular, like clockwork. Every third Thursday." My mind raced. That was 2 days from now. "Can you let me in the building?" I asked. She nodded. "I'll leave the front door unlocked. But how will you get into the apartment itself?" "Leave that to me," I said. The next 2 days were a blur of preparation. I went to a hardware store in a suburb miles away. I bought a crowbar, a heavy-duty sander, several cans of wood stain, and polyurethane sealant. I also bought a simple lockpicking kit, the kind you can order online, and spent hours in my motel room practicing on a cheap padlock. I was clumsy, but I was getting the hang of it. On the third Thursday, as dusk settled over the city, I parked my car a block away and walked to the apartment building, a heavy duffel bag slung over my shoulder. The street was quiet. The front door, as promised, was unlocked. I slipped inside and crept up the stairs. The building was silent. I stood in front of the door to apartment 2. My apartment. Silas's apartment. My hand was shaking as I took out the lock-picking tools. I inserted the tension wrench and the pick. My mind went back to the hours of practice. I felt for the pins. One clicked, then another. It took what felt like an eternity, my ears straining for any sound. But finally, with a soft snick, the lock gave way. I was in. The apartment was exactly as I remembered it. Cold, sterile, and silent. The air was heavy, stagnant. I didn't waste any time. I went straight to his room. The door was locked. I picked that lock too, my fingers more confident this time. I pushed the door open and flicked on the light. The room was the same horrifying shrine. The mattress on the floor, the empty desk, and the symbols, scratched into the dark wood, seemed to pulse with a faint, malevolent energy in the artificial light. This was the heart of the beast. I dropped my duffel bag and got to work. First, the crowbar. I jammed it under one of the floorboards near the center of the room and threw my entire weight on it. The board groaned, splintered, and then came up with a loud crack. I worked with frantic energy, prying up board after board, destroying the integrity of the pattern. The symbols were deep, but they were only on the surface. The wood underneath was clean. Once I had a large section of the floor ripped up, I grabbed the belt sander. The machine roared to life, the sound deafening in the small room. I didn't care about the noise. I had to be fast. I started sanding away the surface of the remaining boards, grinding the ancient, evil geometry into nothing but sawdust. The air filled with fine wood dust. I worked like a man possessed, sweat stinging my eyes, my muscles screaming. I sanded until the entire central circle was gone, leaving nothing but pale, raw wood. The room felt different. The oppressive, heavy feeling was gone. The air felt lighter. I had done it. I had broken the anchor, but I wasn't finished. I had to cover my tracks. I used the wood stain to match the color of the new, raw wood to the old. It wasn't perfect, but in the dim light it might pass. I sealed it with the polyurethane. It smelled terrible, a harsh chemical odor. It was the smell of desecration. I gathered my tools, took one last look at the savaged room, and left, locking both doors behind me. I crept down the stairs and out of the building. The entire operation had taken just under 2 hours. As I walked back to my car, a wave of profound exhaustion and terror washed over me. The trap was set. Silas, or whatever he was, would return to a broken home, a broken power source. I didn't know what would happen. Would he be weakened? Would he be enraged? Would he just wither away? I didn't know. But I knew one thing for sure. He was coming back, and I would be waiting. The hunt was over. The war was about to begin. I didn't go back to the motel. The trap was laid, and I couldn't be miles away when it sprung. I needed to be close to see the aftermath. My car became my command center. I parked it across the street from the apartment building, in a spot that gave me a clear view of the front entrance, but was partially obscured by a large, overgrown lilac bush. I settled in for the long wait. The night dragged on. The chemical smell of the polyurethane I'd used seemed to have seeped into my clothes, a constant, acrid reminder of what I had done. Every passing car, every distant siren, sent a jolt through my nervous system. I was running on pure adrenaline and the dregs of a lukewarm thermos of coffee. What had I actually accomplished? I had vandalized a floor. In the rational world, it was a bizarre and criminal act. But in the world I now inhabited, it was a strategic strike against a century-old monster. I clung to Elias's theory that the apartment was his anchor, his battery. By destroying the symbols, I hadn't just redecorated. I had, I hoped, cut his power cord. Sometime after 3 a.m., a profound exhaustion finally took hold. I must have dozed off, my head against the cool glass of the car window, because I was startled awake by the rumble of a city bus. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the blackness softening to a deep, bruised purple. It was Friday morning. He could be back any time. I watched the building with renewed intensity. The first signs of life appeared. A light went on in a third-floor window. A man in a suit came out and walked briskly toward the L station. The city was waking up, oblivious to the secret war being waged in a second-floor apartment in Logan Square. It was almost 8 a.m. when I saw his car. The dark sedan turned onto the street, moving at a slow, deliberate pace. Parked in a spot just behind my own car. My heart hammered against my ribs. I slouched down in my seat, my ball cap pulled low, praying the overgrown bush and the glare on my windshield would be enough to conceal me. Silas got out of the car. He looked the same as always, calm, composed, his movements economical. He carried a small leather briefcase. He walked to the front of the building, unlocked the door, and went inside. The wait was agonizing. I stared at the front door, at the second-floor windows, expecting, what? An explosion? A scream? The building remained silent, placid, betraying none of the drama I imagined unfolding within. Minutes stretched into an eternity. I timed it on my cheap watch. 10 minutes. 15. At the 20-minute mark, something happened. The window to his room, the room I had violated, flew open with such force that the glass shattered, raining down onto the small patch of grass below. A second later, a guttural roar of pure, inhuman rage echoed down the street. It was a sound that didn't belong in a city, a sound torn from the throat of something ancient and deeply wounded. I saw movement in the shattered window. Silas. He was clutching the window frame, his knuckles white. His face, for the first time, was a mask of utter fury and something else. Pain. He looked diminished, his posture stooped. His tidy, pressed shirt was untucked, his severe hair disheveled. The sterile calm was shattered. He stumbled back from the window and disappeared from view. My theory had been right. It was more than just a floor. It was his life source, and I had ripped it apart. I needed to get out of there. He knew someone had been inside. He would be hunting. He would be unbound by his usual rules of subtle torment. He would be messy, but I couldn't leave. I was rooted to the spot, a moth drawn to a catastrophic flame. A few minutes later, the front door of the building burst open. Mrs. Du Bois, the old woman from the first floor, scurried out, clutching a small suitcase. She looked terrified, her eyes wide as she scanned the street. Our eyes met. I gave a slight nod. She hurried away, disappearing around the corner. A refugee from a war zone only she and I knew existed. She had played her part, and now she was getting out. I was on my own. Then he emerged. Silas staggered out of the front door, clutching his side. He no longer looked like an unassuming data analyst. He looked like a cornered animal. His eyes, wild and burning with a cold, black fire, scanned the street. He was looking for me. I knew it. He could probably smell my fear, even through the glass and steel of the car. He started walking, not towards his car, but down the street, away from me. His gait was unsteady, stumbling. He looked weak, powerfully, dangerously weak. This was my chance, the only one I would ever get. I got out of my car, my legs shaky. I had one last weapon, one I had prepared for this very moment. I opened my trunk. Inside, among the scattered remnants of my life on the road, was a fire extinguisher, but it wasn't filled with CO2. I had emptied it and refilled it with a mixture of salt, iron filings, and ash, materials mentioned in some of the more esoteric books I'd read as being disruptive to spiritual energy, a kind of metaphysical static. It was a wild guess, a shot in the dark based on half-baked theories and ancient folklore. But right now, a shot in the dark was all I had. I grabbed the extinguisher and started after him. I kept my distance, using parked cars for cover. He was heading towards the boulevard, a wide, busy street with a green, tree-lined median. He seemed to be moving without a destination, just driven by pure, wounded rage. He stumbled into the median, into the shade of the old trees. He leaned against an elm, his breathing ragged. This was it. I ran across the street, the heavy extinguisher clutched in my hands, my heart screaming in my chest. He heard me coming. He turned, his face a snarl of hatred. "You," he hissed, his voice raspy and broken. "You ruined it." "It's over, Silas," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "Whatever you are, it's over." He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Over? This is just the beginning. I am not anchored anymore. You have set me free. I will hunt you to the ends of the earth. I will erase everyone you have ever known." He lunged. Even weakened, he was impossibly fast. He closed the distance between us in a blur. But I was ready. I pulled the pin on the extinguisher and squeezed the handle. A thick cloud of gray dust erupted from the nozzle, engulfing him. He screamed, a high, thin sound of agony, as the mixture of salt and iron and ash enveloped him. It clung to his clothes, his skin, his hair. He clawed at his face, his body convulsing. "What is this?" he shrieked, his voice distorting, echoing, just like the creature in the diner. The air around him began to shimmer. His form flickered. He was losing cohesion, his connection to this plane of reality fraying. The destruction of his anchor had made him vulnerable, and this cocktail of ancient remedies was pushing him over the edge. "I'm giving you what you gave them," I shouted over his screams. "A clean slate. I'm erasing you." His body began to dissolve, not violently, but like a photograph fading in the sun. His edges blurred, his form turning into a column of shimmering, agitated dust that mirrored the dust I had sprayed on him. His eyes were the last thing to go. They were fixed on me, filled with a hate that was absolute and eternal. Then they too dissolved into nothing, The column of dust hung in the air for a moment, and then a soft breeze from the boulevard dispersed it, scattering it among the trees and the grass. He was gone. I stood there, panting, the empty fire extinguisher hanging from my hand. It was over. The silence he left behind was profound. The city hummed around me. The traffic on the boulevard, a distant siren, the chatter of birds, all of it blissfully unaware. I dropped the extinguisher and walked away, not looking back. I got in my car and drove, leaving Chicago in my rearview mirror for the last time. I didn't know where I was going. I had the archive, a heavy burden in my trunk. Elias's research had mentioned the others. Silas was gone, but his kind was still out there. I had a weapon. I had knowledge. I was no longer the hunted. My life as Liam Peterson was over. My life as Alex Miller, the drifter, was also over. I was someone else now, a ghost who hunted monsters. I had Elias's journal, and I had a new, terrible purpose. To find the places that were stained. To find the others. To continue the work that he had started. My journey wasn't over. It had just begun. The immediate aftermath of Silas's dissolution was a hollow, ringing silence in my soul. I drove west on the I-90, the same highway that had carried me to Chicago full of naive hope. Now, it was my escape route from a city that would forever be a graveyard in my memory. There was no elation, no sense of victory, just a profound and weary emptiness. I had stared into an abyss and, against all odds, the abyss had blinked first. But the darkness it had revealed was now imprinted on the back of my eyelids. I drove for 2 days, fueled by caffeine and a gnawing dread. I ended up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, a place I chose for its sheer, unremarkable neutrality. I found another faceless motel and collapsed, sleeping for 18 hours straight. When I awoke, the world felt both intensely real and fundamentally fake. The sunlight slanting through the cheap blinds, the drone of the air conditioner, the faint smell of bleach. It was all a thin veneer over the horrifying reality I now knew to be true. The archive sat in the trunk of my car, a Pandora's box I was now cursed to carry. My first instinct was to destroy it, to burn every last piece of Elias's research, find a quiet corner of the country, and try to forget, to try and reclaim some semblance of a normal life. But the faces of the victims in the newspaper clippings were seared into my brain. The sound of Silas's final, agonized shriek was a permanent echo in my ears. Forgetting wasn't an option. It would be a betrayal of Elias and everyone who came before him. I had a choice to make. I could spend the rest of my life as a custodian, a guardian of this terrible knowledge, hiding from the shadows. Or I could take the fight to them. I had a weapon that worked, a set of tactics, however crude, that had proven effective. The idea was terrifying. It was a declaration of war against a species of immortal, invisible predators. It was, in all likelihood, a suicide mission. The decision was solidified by a detail I found while rereading one of Elias's files. It was a note he had written, a quote he had transcribed from a book he'd been reading. It said, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." Elias had underlined it twice. He hadn't just been a victim. He had been trying to become a soldier. I owed it to him to see it through. So my new life began. I was no longer running. I was preparing. I needed money, resources. My cash was almost gone. I spent a month in Sioux Falls working a grueling job at a meatpacking plant. A brutal, physical labor that kept my mind occupied and my body too exhausted for nightmares. I saved every penny. I lived out of my car, ate cheap, and focused on the mission. During my off hours, I became a scholar of the strange. I systematized Elias's research, digitizing the entire archive onto a series of encrypted, military-grade hard drives. I created backups and hid them, mailing one to a P.O. box I'd set up under a new alias in a different state. The physical archive was too precious to keep with me, too dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands. I rented a small, climate-controlled storage unit. The irony was not lost on me, in a remote town in Nebraska, and placed the original trunk inside. It was my legacy, my insurance policy. If I disappeared, the information would still exist. I refined my weapons. The corrupted symbols were the key. I learned to draw them quickly, accurately, on any surface. I carried carving tools, chalk, paint markers. I experimented with the dust mixture, researching folklore and alchemy, adding new elements, powdered silver, crushed quartz, holy water I stole from a church, feeling like a heretic. I didn't know if any of it made a difference, but it was about control, about turning their own esoteric rules against them. I also needed to learn how to find them. Elias's files gave me a starting point, a list of cold cases and geographic hotspots. I created a map, a sprawling web of tragedy, and looked for patterns. They seemed to favor places of transition. College towns, military bases, seasonal tourist spots, places where people were expected to come and go, where a sudden departure wouldn't raise too many alarms. My first hunt took me to a small, picturesque town in the Colorado Rockies. A string of 3 unsolved disappearances over 2 decades, all young men working seasonal jobs at a local ski resort. It was a pattern. I arrived in the fall before the first snow. I took a job as a dishwasher at a local lodge. I listened. I watched. I was looking for the quiet one, the person who didn't quite fit, the one who was too clean, too still, too empty. I found him living in a small, rented cabin on the edge of the woods. He called himself Ben. He worked as a clerk at the local library, a perfect position for a predator who fed on information and histories. He was older than Silas, with a kind, grandfatherly face that made his stillness all the more unsettling. I spent weeks watching him, learning his routine. The fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in my stomach. I was willingly walking into the fire this time, but I was prepared. The confrontation was terrifyingly similar to the one with the creature in the diner. I waited for him outside the library after it closed. I approached him, my heart pounding. I gave him a chance. I mentioned one of the names from the disappearances, a young man named Caleb who had vanished in 2004. I have his family's journal, I lied. He wrote about you. Ben's kind face didn't change, but his eyes went cold, the warmth vanishing like a switched-off light. You're a long way from Chicago, Mr. Peterson, he said softly. He knew. Their network was real. They could communicate, share information in ways I couldn't comprehend. My anonymity was a fiction. The fight was short, brutal, and silent. He was strong, his grandfatherly facade hiding a terrible, wiry power. But I was ready. I had a small, sharp gouge in my hand. As he reached for me, I sidestepped and carved a broken spiral into the wooden signpost of the library. The effect was the same. The shimmering air, the soundless scream of a being undone, the slow, agonizing erasure from existence. When it was over, I stood panting in the cold mountain air, alone again. There was no sense of accomplishment, just a grim, weary confirmation. I could do this. I could actually fight back. And so it went. I became a ghost, a myth in their secret world. I moved from town to town, following the trail of cold cases left in Elias's files. I became a master of identities, of blending in, of becoming the gray man no one ever noticed. I was a dishwasher in Vermont, a farmhand in Oregon, a janitor in New Mexico. I hunted them one by one. I found a woman who called herself Cassandra in a sleepy coastal town in Maine. I found a man who went by a simple John near a military base in Arizona. Each time, the fear was fresh. Each time, the confrontation was a razor's edge between my life and my erasure. Each time, I left another corrupted symbol carved into the landscape. A ward, a warning, a gravestone. I was cleaning up their messes. I was erasing the erasers, but I was also becoming something I didn't recognize. The constant vigilance, the paranoia, the violence, it was changing me. I was becoming as cold and detached as they were. I rarely spoke. I made no friends. I allowed myself no connections. To have a friend, to have a loved one, would be to give them a hostage. I was utterly, completely alone. Years passed. The face I saw in the mirror became a stranger's, weathered and hard, the eyes holding a permanent look of haunted vigilance. The war was taking its toll, and they were learning. The last one I faced, in a dusty town in West Texas, had been waiting for me. He knew about the symbols. He tried to destroy the surface I was carving on before I could finish. I only survived because I was faster, because I had anticipated it. They were adapting. They knew there was a hunter now. They knew my methods. The game was getting more dangerous. One day I received an email. It was sent to an encrypted account I had set up, an account whose address I had left tucked inside the original journal in the Nebraska storage unit, a message in a bottle cast into the digital sea. I had never told a soul it existed. The email was from an address that was just a random string of numbers and letters. The message itself was short, just a few lines. I read your story. I think my sister was one of them. She disappeared from her college in Eugene, Oregon, 10 years ago. Her roommate was a quiet, tidy woman named Anya. The police said my sister just ran away. I never believed it. I have her things. I have her diaries. I think I can help you. I'm not afraid. It was signed with a single name, Rachel. My blood ran cold. Someone had found the archive. Someone had found my message. For the first time in years, I wasn't alone. But the question was this a trap? Was it one of them, adapting their tactics, trying to lure me in with a story of a grieving sister? Or was it what it appeared to be? An ally? A recruit? To trust her could be a fatal mistake. But to ignore her could be to turn my back on the one person in the world who might understand, the one person who could help me in a war I was beginning to realize I could not win on my own. I had to make a choice, to remain a ghost or to risk everything on the hope of a human connection. I sat in my lonely motel room, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating my face, and I typed a reply. Where and when? The reply I sent was a set of instructions, cold and precise, born from years of paranoia. I gave her a time and a place, the main reading room of the public library in Salt Lake City, a week from then. I told her to sit at a specific table, to place a copy of Moby Dick on the table in front of her, and to wait. I told her I would not approach her directly. I would call the main library phone number and ask the front desk to bring a telephone to her table. If any part of this protocol was not followed, I would be gone. For the next week, I was a wreck. I drove to Salt Lake, my mind a churning sea of possibilities. If it was a trap, this was how I died. They had adapted. They would use my own methodology against me, using a lure of connection to draw me into the open. The hunter would finally become the hunted. Yet, a part of me, a small, atrophied part that still remembered being Liam Peterson, hoped it was real. On the appointed day, I was in the library hours early. I didn't go to the main reading room. I went to the second-floor mezzanine, to a small corral in the history section that overlooked her designated table. From there, I could see everything. The entrances, the exits, the table itself. I watched as people came and went. My heart pounded with every person who walked near that table. At exactly 2 o'clock, she walked in. I knew it was her instantly. She was a woman in her early 30s, with dark, tired eyes that seemed to hold a permanent sadness. She looked normal, frighteningly normal. She clutched a thick, worn copy of Moby Dick to her chest like a shield. She found the table, sat down, and placed the book in front of her. Then she folded her hands and waited. She didn't look around nervously. She didn't fidget. She just sat with a quiet, resolute stillness that was both reassuring and terrifying. I watched her for a full hour. I watched everyone around her. There were no accomplices, no suspicious figures lurking in the stacks. It was just a woman waiting in a library. Finally, with a trembling hand, I pulled out my cheap burner phone and dialed the library's number. Salt Lake City Public Library. How may I direct your call? Yes, I said, my voice hoarse. I need to speak to a woman in the main reading room. Her name is Rachel. She's at table 4B with a copy of Moby Dick. There was a pause. Sir, we don't typically. It's an emergency. I lied. Please. I heard the librarian sigh, then the muffled sound of her calling for a page. I watched from my perch as a young library employee brought a cordless phone to her table. Rachel looked at it, startled, then took it. Hello? She said, her voice small and tentative. Tell me about your sister. I said, my voice low. Her name was Sarah, Rachel said without hesitation. She was studying botany. She loved the rain. Her roommate, Anya, was from Sweden, a transfer student. She was quiet, tidy. After Sarah disappeared, Anya stayed for another month, helping us look, pretending to be sad. Then she just vanished. The college had no record of her home address. The international student program she claimed to be with didn't exist. She spoke with the weary precision of someone who had told the story 1,000 times to 1,000 disbelieving ears. "What did you find in her diaries?" I asked my final test. She wrote that Anya didn't seem to have a past. No family photos, no stories from home. She said Anya would hum sometimes, a strange, tuneless sound, and she wrote about her things being moved. Small things, a hairbrush, a textbook. She thought she was losing her mind. In the last entry, she wrote, "I feel like I'm fading, like she's looking right through me and seeing an empty room." I closed my eyes. It was the same script, the same psychological warfare. It was real. She was real. "Don't move," I said, and hung up. I walked down the marble staircase and approached her table. She looked up as I neared, her eyes widening with a mixture of fear and recognition. She was looking at a fellow survivor. I sat down opposite her. We were two strangers in a library, bound by an impossible, secret grief. "I'm Liam," I said, using my own name for the first time in years. Felt strange and foreign in my mouth. She pushed a worn leather journal across the table. Her sisters. "I thought I was the only one," she whispered. That meeting changed everything. Rachel was not a warrior. She was a librarian, a researcher by trade. Her grief had not turned her into a hunter, but into a historian. While I had been crisscrossing the country with carving tools and cans of ash, she had been building an archive of her own, a digital fortress of information about her sister's case and other similar disappearances she had found. She had hacked into university databases, filed Freedom of Information Act requests, and built a detailed profile of the entity that had called itself Anya. We spent the next week in a cheap rental house on the edge of the Salt Flats, a landscape as stark and empty as our lives had become. We merged our research, my archive of the past, of Elias's work and the victims I had avenged, combined with her modern digital investigation. We didn't just have a collection of tragedies anymore, we had a playbook. Rachel presented a new philosophy, a different path forward. "You can't kill them all, Liam," she said one evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the salt-crusted earth. "You run around playing whack-a-mole, and for every one you erase, 2 more are erasing someone else. You're fighting their war on their terms, with violence and erasure. It's the only thing that's worked," I argued. "No," she said, her eyes intense. "Their greatest weapon isn't their strength. It's the silence. It's the fact that no one believes the stories. They win because they make the world forget. So we have to fight them by remembering." Her plan was audacious. We would stop hunting them one by one. Instead, we would build a network, a digital underground railroad for information. We would find other survivors, other family members of the lost. We would gather their stories. We would build an unerasable record. We would publish the symbols, the patterns, the names of the victims, and the aliases of the predators. We wouldn't fight them in the shadows. We would drag them, kicking and screaming, into the light. Our weapon would not be a carving gouge. It would be a website, shielded by layers of encryption and hidden on the dark web, but accessible to those who knew where to look. It would be a beacon for the lost and the grieving, a place where their stories would be believed, a place to teach others how to see, how to notice the quiet ones, how to protect themselves. It was a new kind of war, and for the first time I felt a flicker of something that wasn't just survival but hope. We started that night. We bought new equipment, set up secure servers. I became the security expert, the tactician, using my years of paranoia to build our defenses. Rachel became the archivist, the voice, the heart of the operation. She wrote with a raw, powerful eloquence, telling her sister's story, telling Elias's story, telling my story. The work was slow, painstaking, but it felt different. I wasn't just erasing. I was building. We live a strange, nomadic life now, Rachel and I, We move from town to town, always vigilant, always working. We are partners. We are the sole members of a conspiracy of two. The fear is still there, a constant companion. We know they are out there. We know they are hunting us. But we are no longer hiding. Our website is live. We call it the Echo Project. In the first few months, there was only silence. Then the first email arrived. A man whose father, a truck driver, had vanished from a rest stop in Nevada in 1993. His last postcard home mentioned a strange, quiet fellow he'd been sharing coffee with. Then another, and another. Stories trickling in from the forgotten corners of the country. A trickle of echoes, refusing to fade. The war is far from over. I know that one day we might have to fight again. One of them might find us. But now something is different. I am no longer a ghost, haunted by the past. My name is Liam Peterson. I am a brother, a son, and a friend. I am the custodian of an archive, the guardian of a beacon. I still look over my shoulder. I still see shadows in every corner. But I am no longer alone in the darkness. And for the first time in a very long time, I believe the light might win.